Imagine you have poured months and even years into building a great product and you finally did it. You grown your user base, even you made it to the headlines. But deep down, you don't know why your product is attracting so many customers. And this uncertainty, the situation of not understanding why some features are more successful than others, or why the whole product experience is so cool for your customers, this uncertainty haunts even to the most successful teams in product or user experience design. For this reason, I decided to talk to Dr. Martin Tingley. He is an expert on experimentation and has been working a long time with global brands such as Netflix, now Microsoft, at improving continuously products on the basis of credible statistics and business intuition. This conversation is interesting for you even though you don't know much about statistics, because if you're working in product or engineering, asking better questions and testing assumptions is a key ability to iterate and improve on a constant base. In the second part of this conversation, I ask more specific concepts and specific questions to Martin for to illuminate dilemmas and trade-offs that you have when you're working with experimentation. There are three concepts that are very useful in general outside of this episode. And if you're in product engineering or even experimentation, you should know concepts such as hypothesis testing, power, p-values. Those are the essence of experimentation. And it's really interesting to hear from Martin and his experience how these three concepts are intertwined at the moment of creating good products and improving them constantly. I hope this conversation is insightful for you. Subscribe and let me know your comments. Thank you. Welcome, Martin. Thank you so much for your time. How are you doing today?
I'm well, David. Thank you so much for the opportunity to chat this afternoon.
Amazing. I would like to start asking you two basic questions for our audience that is not too familiar with the topic. What exactly is experimentation? Why is so critical for product development in today's business?
Experimentation, the way we use it to develop products, particularly digital products, is a super old idea. It goes back more than 100 years to folks like R.A. Fisher working at Rothamsted Research Center, trying to grow better crops for the UK. And the idea is really simple. You want to grow better tomatoes, you want to increase your click-through rate on a website. What you do is only one thing, have those two experiences running in parallel. In the agricultural setting, you take several plots of land, give them different fertilizers, and measure your yields. In the digital setting, maybe you change a call to action on a sign up flow, give that new call to action to half of your customers at random, keep the old call to action for the rest of your customers, and then compare that click through rate business metric. It's a way to leverage the scientific method for this improvement. That's one of the amazing things of this. You work in experimentation at Netflix and now in Microsoft, two companies known for their data driven culture. What fundamental difference have you observed between organizations that merely run occasional tests versus those who have a built infrastructure for experimentation? It's a great question. And there's even many differences between Netflix and what I've found in the Windows organization at Microsoft. Netflix grew up with experimentation in some sense. Netflix as a company is about 25 years old. They've been running experiments since the earliest I found when I worked there was roughly the year 2000. So get that multiple decades of dedication to leveraging experiments and A/B tests for effectively all decision making. The Windows organization at Microsoft has a different history. It's a 40-year-old piece of software. And for most of its history, the way you updated your Windows operating system was via physical media, be it a 3.5-inch floppy disk, a CD. And so there's a very much different culture between the two organizations and a different level of dedication to making decisions by experiments. The Windows organization is a little bit earlier in that journey, and I'm excited to help them get further on it.
That sounds very exciting. I would like to start asking more specific questions. I was talking to a friend. He's
working for a while in experimentation as well. And we were talking about the traditional statistical methods or statistical thresholds using a p-value of 0.05 and a confidence interval of 95% to validity of results. You suggested in a recent article, I think in Harvard, that these thresholds not necessarily might be optimal. And can you share what you learned in Netflix about using different thresholds and about not using only one specific one to discover innovation?
Happy to, David. This is a topic that I can go on and on about. Please cut me off if I go too far down the rabbit hole. We've all inherited a certain tradition of null hypothesis stats testing. It goes back more than 100 years. But when you take a step back and ask yourself, why are we running experiments at a place like Microsoft, like any company? The reason we're running these experiments is to improve some type of business outcome, right? Ultimately, that needs to relate back to revenue, to customer retention, to the top drivers of business performance. Through that lens, we're using experiments in service of optimization. There's some metric that the company tracks, and we want to make it go up as steeply as possible. If you view this as an optimization problem, that alpha equals 0.05, that 95% confidence interval, that 80% power, these are all suddenly free parameters in an optimization problem. The question you can ask yourself is, if our goal is to make that line go up as quickly as possible, what should we set those values to? Any exercise like that involves a lot of assumptions. So some of the work I did my last year at Netflix was to explore that question, both from a theory side and by examining our data. The game is to take your historical distribution of tests, figure out what is my distribution of past treatment effects, what are conventional experimental design parameters, what are constraints, like maybe a constraint if you can only put a single user in one test at a time. View it as an optimization problem. What we found both through those empirical exercises and through hiring a very smart intern called Timothy Sudajano, he's your colleague at Stanford, Netflix's experimentation practice was suboptimal from a decision theoretic perspective. The company would make metrics go up faster if it ran many more tests at lower sample size or made decisions at less stringent p-values. And there's a cost to doing this. And the cost is you'll make more wrong decisions. And there's a concern always that you make a wrong decision that sort of takes your innovation pathway down the wrong track. But the size of the impact effects we were seeing, quite convincing. If you really want to optimize metrics, it's a very simple message. Run more tests. Don't worry about small sample sizes. Run more tests, make the best decisions that you can, and really approach product development with a sense of urgency.
So let me see if I understand correctly. By running more tests and not necessarily being constrained by these paradigms of experimentation, we're basically validating mode of being scrappy, trying one, trying two, trying three, until we find the right recipe of our product.
I think so. I'd add to that, it's about continuous improvement on that product. Every time we randomize and give different experiences to different sets of customers or members, it's an opportunity to learn and make a decision. And the more opportunities for learning and decision-making we put in front of ourselves, the more rapidly we can improve our products.
That's amazing. And I think reading a book, The Art of Failing, she says something complex that you probably understand well, which is the mindset of failing, challenging for managers, because sometimes they either want to do everything perfect, even if it's an experiment, which comes at the cost of not discovering new ways. I want to ask you about how you approach balancing short-term revenue gains versus long-term user experience, particularly in the context like advertising versus subscription revenue or user retention. And I know you've done a lot of these optimizations in those contexts.
That's a great question. Problem I've worked on and thought about it. The hardest example of a trade-off problem that comes up with experimentation is when you run a test, ultimately you need to make a decision. You need a metric upon which you'll base that decision. At Netflix, we started to think about this a lot when Netflix announced it was going to have an ads product. Historically, the company's sole revenue stream was a subscription. But the same phenomena shows up for social media companies where they're trying to balance short-term ads revenue versus long-term folks continuing to use the product. There's probably similar examples from Microsoft I just haven't discovered yet. The challenge emerges because short-term ads revenue is really easy to move around. Company like Facebook doubles their ad load, they're going to make a lot more money in the short term. But what these companies really wanted including a place like Netflix, is optimized for long-term revenue. Taking the Netflix example, long-term revenue is from subscription. It's from you deciding month on month to continue paying those few dollars to get all access to all the content. In the context of any A/B test, it's really hard to measure the impact on the long-term revenue, right? We can change the ad load on a streaming service, immediately changes revenue. But what does it do for your long-term satisfaction as a customer or user of that product? Probably the more ads we put on, the more it degrades that customer satisfaction. So how do we find that balance? It's a really hard problem because it's very difficult to measure those long-term outcomes.
That's a very powerful trade-off. And I guess in finding the right balance, you emphasize on the curiosity and humility you need in the experimentation culture.
I don't know if we quite answered your last question. And I don't think we are going to answer it because I think it's a really hard one. And I don't want to leave your listeners with an idea of how to address some of these problems. Take a meta-analysis approach and say, we've run a whole bunch of these experiments. We know all the short-term outcomes. We measure the long-term outcomes. Then we learn across, say, 100 experiments and really tease out the relationship between the short and long-term metrics. Another solution is to eat the cost and run some experiments for a long time so you can actually establish what that trade-off is and use those long-running experiments to develop overall evaluation criteria or trade-offs between those metrics.
Let's suppose you are in a scenario where the product is failing, it's a crisis perhaps. Which of those solutions would you choose with that pressure in mind?
I think if your product is in crisis mode, you're not in a position to worry about these types of optimizations. You're more in the mode of how do I achieve product market fit? Perhaps your product's in crisis mode because you tried to monetize too early before you had product fit. Suddenly you're having revenue optimization issues. Going back to that product market fit is how I would suggest folks go about that. And in terms of establishing product market fit, run more tests, get more ideas in front of your users, take every opportunity you can to learn something and make a new decision.
That makes total sense. I recently had an interview for company I cannot mention, and they asked the same, you're on a crisis, would you run experiments? I think the answer was no. I went into the rabbit hole of the experiment itself. Very illuminating answer. I want to ask you about this culture of humility and curiosity. Organizations embrace failure and learning to make these decisions despite ambiguity or the pressure of the market?
It's a great question. And I love this quote from Linus Pauling. If you don't believe me, you should probably believe a Nobel Prize winner. What Linus Pauling says is if you want to have good ideas, you must have many ideas. Most of them will be wrong and to learn which ones to throw away. Every company that does a lot of experimentation knows most ideas do not result in rollouts, but we still learn from them. Every time you randomize and put different experiences, folks, you can learn something about customer preferences. Success or not, you learn something from the test that informs what you test next. You just get these flywheels going. It is a change. It requires humility. It's very easy to fall back to what Microsoft calls the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion. But if you're doing that, you're only letting one person vote on how to evolve a product. If you vote with your hands in a small room, maybe you let 10 people decide how to evolve your product. Digital experimentation allows millions of people to vote via their actions on your product with what decisions you should. It's an incredibly powerful, democratized form of decision making. But yes, you need to embrace it with a fair amount of humility. And there's an anecdote from Netflix, which had an extremely strong culture of data-driven decision. One point many years ago, the chief content officer had this idea of putting what we call pre-roll in front of films. If you hit play on a film on Netflix, the idea was you'd see one trailer for another film. The idea was to expose folks to more content. This was many years before Netflix considered an ad product. But many companies, if someone in the C-suite had an idea like that, would just do it. What happened at Netflix was his idea went to the front of the line. It was A/B tested. Our members were clear with their actions that they did not like this idea, so we didn't roll it out. I appreciate this anecdote because it shows that even at that executive level, folks had the humility to say, I've got an idea, I'm important, my idea is going to the front of the line. But then we listened to our members, and if the Netflix members didn't think it was a good idea, it got thrown out just like everyone else's idea. Seeing that example from leaders is a powerful way to promote that culture of humility and learning.
It sounds that the back end of experimentation is a good communication skill at the organizational level from the leadership and the staff and members. Communication is, I don't know if you experience this in your background, but communication right now, given that you have multiple ways of working, distributed work, remote work, hybrid work. In that end, I would like to ask you something. I have several friends that are entrepreneurs. And every time I try to sell them the idea of experimentation, they are not quite convinced. I understand that experimentation is not useful when you're starting a business. But if you go with the mindset of experimentation, that might lead you to a product. So I would like to ask you, with experimentation tools becoming more accessible, how should you, how startups can create the environment when they experiment more and take advantage of these new tools?
It's a great question. And I think OpenAI is a really interesting example. Just YOLO'd ChatGPT out into the world. My understanding is at the time didn't have a product team. They certainly didn't have any product data scientists. Their product blew up. What did they do next? They started hiring product folks and product data scientists. And I assume they are figuring out how to leverage things like A/B testing to optimize every aspect of that product that they've now built, which has been so successful. If a company is sophisticated and successful as OpenAI decides immediately after product launch, oh boy, we need some product people. We need to start doing A/B testing to figure out how to make this all work. I think that's a great example for other entrepreneurs. As a startup, you need to chuck something out into the market. But I do think you need to be extremely flexible with how you go about identifying product market fit. Experimentation can become one of your more powerful tools to do that, right? You should listen to your team, do some market research, but start nudging one set of customers towards one version of your product, another towards a second version of your product, and kind of learn, helps you course correct along the way. To our earlier thread of our conversation, if you're in crisis mode, maybe you don't have time for that. Maybe you've just got to take some risks. But anytime you can leverage that experimentation framework, you're going to learn more about customer preferences. And I think ultimately you'll make better decisions.
That makes total sense. And talking about that early stage, right? What type of things startups should prioritize for testing and optimization? And I like that you focus experimentation towards the optimization problem of allocating resources.
Early stage startups, you're not going to have a huge number of customers. Because of that, the kind of effect sizes you'll be able to measure are only going to be quite large. There's basically no point in testing for small micro optimizations across algorithm hyperparameters. At some point, Google ran this famous N shades of blue experiment. You probably can't do that as an early stage startup. You just won't find signal. You need to test big things, or you need to test things where you know there's going to be a lot of customer sensitivity. In places where we know there's a lot of customer sensitivity are things like calls to action, anything on a sign up flow page, those critical moments when a potential customer is deciding to give you money or not, deciding to log into your product, deciding to give it a go. Those moments of decision are places where experimentation can be very valuable, because it can really help you optimize those key decision moments for potential customers that will lead to growth for your young company.
That's very insightful. And I would like to ask you a last question. Many of us here in Stanford and other universities are interested on working in experimentation. What will be your suggestion for us and for all others applying to jobs, seeking to become better at experimentation and using it as a tool to improve products?
It's a great question. And I think my answer will apply to all data science roles. The technical part of the job is the easy part, right? We run a lot of t-tests. It's not rocket science. The goal is to advance the business. What I see great data scientists doing in experimentation and beyond is keeping that technical toolkit closed for longer and focusing more on understanding the business landscape, understanding the challenges posed by the business, and then understanding how to structure those business challenges as data science challenges, and only then opening the toolkit. The advice I'd give to potential data scientists, including those involved in experimentation, is to focus on that business understanding. Ultimately, we're using our data science toolkit to advance the business. So we have to ground our work in business thinking. Does that answer your question?
That answers totally my question. Of just focusing on, for example, reading papers is more about what is the challenge that Netflix is experiencing in certain time relative to what Microsoft is doing or other competitors. And from there, figuring out what tools need.
So if you're going for a data science experimentation job interview at company X, you could prep by studying hard causal inference papers, or you could prep by reading the last few quarterly reports from that publicly traded company, getting on that company's product, poking at it and asking yourself, what would I want to improve here? How would I structure that test? And demonstrating to those interviewers that you're going to approach your work from the mindset of the business, the product, and growing them both versus just being someone who can crunch numbers.
Thank you so much for this valuable insight and feedback and wonderful examples. I appreciate this opportunity and hope next time to ask you interesting questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.